Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm here to do a better late than never January wrap-up. So I don't want to pigeonhole myself too much, but usually the bulk of what I read every month are novels. They tend to be what I enjoy the most, what I just choose to spend most of my time reading. So January was an extremely weird reading month for me because I only read one novel this month, and it was a reread. So I didn't read any new novels. This month is going to be a weird mix of things. You are going to be seeing a lot of short stories, a little bit of nonfiction, and a lot of Norse mythology. So let's get started. I started off 2018 by rereading one of my favorite books, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez. And the reason I read this one was back in December, I was reading The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, and I could not stop comparing the two books. They share so many similarities, so I knew that it was inevitable. Once I finished that book, I would definitely have to return to 100 Years of Solitude. And a few weeks ago, I made a video comparing the two works in greater detail. If you want to check that out, I'll link it down below. But essentially, I had such an incredible time experiencing this book for the second time. And I do say experience. It's not just a book that you pick up and you read and you flip through the pages. This is a book that I feel is so captivating. I'm entranced by the first page, and I felt just so swept up and carried away in this saga of the Buendia family. By the time you reach the end of these pages, you have gone through something significant. My copy of the book has a short biography at the back, and there were a few lines in here that jumped out and helped me appreciate the book differently on my second read through. So it's talking about how Márquez spent the first 8 years of his life living with his maternal grandparents in Colombia, and his writing is profoundly influenced by this time of his life. And it talks about how he spent his time listening to their nonstop stories, superstitions, and folk beliefs, unable to distinguish between the real and the fabulous, not least because of their way of storytelling, especially that of his grandmother. They recounted the most improbable happenings with the same facial and vocal expressions with which they recounted fact. The magical realism in this book never feels gimmicky or whimsical, but rather it seems like it's just a way of interpreting reality, where you've got fact and fiction completely blurred, but there still is truth in these stories. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It's the way that we perceive these events. And that's why I'm so fascinated by the way he uses magical realism, and especially some of the beautiful images that it creates throughout this book. So needless to say, I really enjoyed rereading this book. It was a wonderful way to start off my reading year. There's a ridiculous quote on the back of my book that says 100 Years of Solitude is the first piece of literature since the book of Genesis that should be required reading for the entire human race. And I think that that's a little ridiculous. I mean, I don't think that there's any book that should be required reading for every human on the planet, but if you are looking for something powerful and that it explores the human experience in a really unique way, 100 Years of Solitude is an amazing novel. After reading 100 Years of Solitude, I wanted to continue on with some more Márquez, so I picked up this short story collection called Innocent Eréndira and Other Stories, and it was wildly uneven, to say the least. So the best story in this collection is the title one, Innocent Eréndira and Her Heartless Grandmother. The title pretty much says it all. It's about a girl named Eréndira who lives with her evil grandmother. She accidentally leaves a candle lit and their house ends up burning down in the middle of the night. And her grandmother is not cool about this and essentially expects Eréndira to pay her back for all of the damages and all of the things that she's lost. So she does this by essentially pimping out Eréndira to just dozens of men a day. They have this traveling roadshow, so it's a very disturbing story, not a nice little concept, and actually Eréndira and her grandmother made a brief appearance in 100 Years of Solitude, so these two texts are kind of linked in the same world. It was a pretty entertaining story, even though it was really upsetting, and the ending was pretty fabulous. You know, there was a good tale of revenge at the end, so I did enjoy reading that story, but I can't say that I liked anything else in this collection. There were a lot more short stories after this, and I didn't find any of them really that memorable. It's a lot of Márquez's earlier works, so you can see he is like trying to do amazing things. He writes a lot about life after death. You can see that he's heavily influenced by William Faulkner, which was interesting, but yeah, I just really did not enjoy these stories. So aside from Eréndira, I can't say that I enjoyed this collection very much. Continuing along with short stories, I read The Doll's Alphabet by Camilla Grudova. This is a debut collection by a Canadian writer, and I'm very excited to have discovered her because, as a Canadian myself, I do feel like I should be trying to keep tabs on some Canadian writers, but my problem is that a lot of the time, Canlit can seem like a pretty stale and familiar genre sometimes, so it's very exciting to find a voice that is just doing their own thing outside of the whole Canlit tradition. So that's why I'm very pleased to have discovered Camilla Grudova. Even though online you'll see that her work gets compared to Margaret Atwood and Angela Carter a lot, I really do feel like Camilla Grudova has a truly unique voice, and she's created a world almost in these short stories. Even though they all have separate subject matters, they almost feel like they exist in the same world, but it's, very unfamiliar in a lot of ways. You can't quite connect it to a specific time or place, even though a lot of elements in here seem familiar. Like at times you think you might be in the Victorian era, but then you're kind of thrown all over the place. So that's what's quite unique about this collection. I was reading an interview with the author, and she was talking about how her books have been classified. And she said, "I've heard a lot of terms, weird fiction or magical realism, as opposed to realism. But I dislike the term realism quite intensely. I wonder, whose reality is that? The things I write are very realistic to me." So that was an excellent point. I mean, every person perceives reality differently. It's not like there's some shared genre. So just because someone has a more outlandish interpretation of reality doesn't mean that they need to be classified as weird or magical, right? So the reality in these books is maybe more similar to ones that you might find in dreams or strange surrealist films, but it still is told in quite a factual tone. It is presented as one person's interpretation of reality, and I just found Camilla Grudova's mind fascinating, so I really liked perceiving the world through her lens. I really enjoyed the way that Grudova plays with language, and some of her descriptions did really catch me off guard. Here's one such example. It's talking about a group of sailors who caught an octopus and they're pulling it up on board. The catch was a multitude of colors and textures, like the thigh of an old debauched prince squished into a stocking. The bulbous head of the octopus a blister ripe with pus. So she is doing some very inventive things with her language and with her subject matter. You will see fantastical creatures like mermaids, werewolves, and women who turn themselves into sewing machines, and yet these are still realistic stories about problems that people can find relatable to their everyday lives, so I couldn't recommend this highly enough. I did really enjoy this collection. Another strange short story collection I read this month was Things We Lost in the Fire, stories by Mariana Enríquez. She's an Argentinian author, and this is the first collection of her stories to appear in English. I hope that there is going to be more that will appear later because I am very intrigued in her work after reading these stories. Her stories are very dark, very atmospheric. She is definitely playing around with the Gothic tradition, but her stories are also set in contemporary Argentina, and she tackles a lot of social issues with her fiction as well. So instead of these moody Gothic stories that are set in castles where you're dealing with rich Victorian people, it's almost interesting to see the same genre play out on the streets of Buenos Aires with these characters that are dealing with poverty and all sorts of social ailments. So this was a really fascinating collection in a lot of ways. As with most short story collections, some of these stories were a lot more effective than the others. It also depends on you as a reader, like the things that you are going to find creepy and unsettling is going to depend on which story I think that you're going to be most interested in. But I was grabbed by quite a few of these stories. I remember I was reading the last story in this collection, Things We Lost in the Fire. It was late at night, and one of the shelves on this bookshelf behind me snapped, and it created this big noise, and I almost had a heart attack because I was really freaked out reading the story, and this big noise happened, and it was just it showed me how intense these stories were because I legitimately felt like I was going to die. These stories are excellent if you're looking for something unsettling to read late into the night, or if you like horror that has some literary substance and social consequences. These short stories were quite powerful, and I'm really glad that I gave this collection a try. My nonfiction read of the month was a book called We Were Feminists Once, From Riot Girl to Cover Girl, The Buying and Selling of a Political Movement by Andi Zeisler. So the title pretty much explains what this book is about. It kind of talks about how feminism is mainstream in a lot of ways today. We've got a lot of prominent celebrities that have come out as spokespeople for feminism, and we've got a lot of advertisements that claim to be very feminist, but a lot of the times the feminism that we engage with today is kind of meaningless and it doesn't actually achieve anything. So in order for feminism to be popular, it actually had to be kind of declawed and made more palatable for the mainstream, and we're not actually achieving a lot of feminist goals. It's a worthwhile subject to be exploring, but my issue was that maybe she didn't go in depth enough into her topics, where I felt like I didn't learn a lot reading this book, and that's kind of what I go to looking for in nonfiction. I want to really learn new facts that I hadn't thought about before, and Zeisler's concept was kind of familiar to me. I don't think a lot of us have a lot of faith in advertising or the mainstream media to begin with, so it's not like a radical takedown or anything. And I found it really depended on the subject of each chapter as to whether I was interested in her points. So there was a really good chapter on film, but some of the other chapters weren't kind of as gripping as they could have been. So it was a bit of an uneven book for me, even though it has a good message. And there was a really hilarious part of this book where she makes fun of the word empowerment and how that's used in advertising, and it essentially means nothing. So I do laugh every time I see the word empowerment now. So this was a solid 3-star read for me. You know, I enjoyed reading through it most of the time, but there was nothing in here that was really groundbreaking or that had me really shift my perspective. So I'd say if you're interested in the topic, it's a fun read, but not required reading by any means. The next few books all have to do with Norse mythology, which I became kind of obsessed with this month. I'm thinking about making a longer video on this topic, kind of like an introduction to Norse mythology, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. And for that reason, I'm going to be as brief as possible when talking about these books, and I'll go into them more depth in a Norse mythology video. So the first book that I started off with was the Poetic Edda, and this was the book that I was the most intimidated about, because this is a collection of really old poetry, and these poems contain most of what we know about Norse mythology, and it seems like there's a lot of information that seems to have been lost over the years, but still what we have is pretty incredible. This collection starts off with a poem called The Seeress's Prophecy, and she talks about the beginning of the world leading up to the end of the world, which is known as Ragnarok. And honestly, Ragnarok was like my favorite thing to read about. You have to understand, I'm like the kind of kid that read the book of Revelations in the Bible for fun because I thought this vision of the apocalypse was so interesting, and Ragnarok is even better. Like, our world is going up in flames, there's going to be an intense battle between the gods. It is the most intense thing that you're going to read about, and the best part about Ragnarok is that it hasn't happened yet, so this is something that we can all look forward to, apparently. Sometimes the poems could be a little bit cryptic, but overall the stories are so strong that you almost forget that you're reading them in ancient translated verse. After the Poetic Edda, I decided to read the Prose Edda. This is again a pretty major source of where we get a lot of our information on Norse mythology, and the bonus part about this book is that it's written, like it says, in prose. So these stories are a little bit more easier to follow, especially once you have the Poetic Edda under your belt. And although these were easier to understand and it deals with most of the same material from the Poetic Edda, I really actually preferred the poetic forms of these stories. And I thought these ones kind of seemed a little straightforward, and I thought there was more of a magical vibe in the poetic version, so I was kind of shocked to discover that I preferred that, but this was still a pretty good starting point as well. And then after that, I worked my way up to reading Neil Gaiman's collection that came out last year called Norse Mythology. So again, these are retellings of the same myths that you're going to find in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, but these were really the most easy to read because it's written in this very contemporary style, very fluid. You can tell that he's very intrigued with Loki, the trickster figure. But even though he adds a few extra humorous details, I was surprised with how faithful Gaiman is to the original sources of these stories, and he's not adding a lot of extra material. I almost would have liked for him to put more personality into these stories, because after reading reading them 2 times already, I was kind of looking for a different spin. But that being said, they're such strong stories that it's really hard to mess them up, so I still did enjoy this collection quite a lot. And then the last book that I read on the subject was the Saga of the Volsungs. I wanted to read this because it was a huge influence to the composer Richard Wagner when he was writing his Ring Cycle, and if you're not familiar with the world of opera, the Ring Cycle is a crazy ambitious project. It is 4 interconnected operas. Most of them are crazy long, crazy intense, put a lot of demand on the performers and the audience to make it through it. But a lot of the subject matter comes from Norse mythology, so it was really interesting to read this book and see where he got a lot of his characters. It's less about the gods, but more about people, and particularly families, that the gods sort of show up in their lives a little bit, but it's mostly a lot of people drama. We've got war and betrayal and love and so many murders. If you like a high death count, then you're going to love these stories because everybody is murdering everybody, and it made for a good time in my opinion. Lastly, the most intriguing book that I read this month was a slim little biography about Keanu Reeves. My boyfriend works at a high school as well, and the library were throwing out a bunch of books, and this was going to be one of them because apparently Keanu is not relevant to teenagers anymore. But luckily he saved it and brought the copy home to me, and I greatly enjoyed this book. It was very strange. The best part about it is that it's written in verse. So it's almost like you're reading poems about the strange life of Keanu Reeves. And the weirdest part about this book is that the tone seems so somber, and you come away from it feeling bad for Keanu. And I think most of these books are supposed to be about celebrities and how talented they are and how awesome their lives are, but this one was just really melancholy in a lot of ways. It talks about how many box office flops Keanu has starred in, or how he got typecasted from a young age, or how so many people close to him have died tragic deaths. So you do walk away from this book feeling kind of sad about Keanu, but it was quite an engrossing read. So, you know, it was like 30 pages, but a lot of tragedy happened within that span, so very incredible poetry. So those are all the books that I read this January. Like I said, it was a very weird reading month for me, but it was a very enjoyable one. So I'm off to a good start for my 2018 reading year. Unfortunately, I have just started a new teaching job, so that means that I have almost no time to read books that I actually want to read. So I can guarantee you that February is going to be a bit of a tragic month for me. But anyway, in the meantime, please let me know if you've read anything good so far this year, or if you're reading anything good now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again later.